Hey everyone. So here we are at part 5 in chapter 1, the main themes of microbiology, part 5, the general characteristics of microorganisms. And again, this little section of the chapter, we will be going into much deeper detail in future chapters in the textbook. So this again is just an introduction and an overview kind of what's to come. So from this section, you should learn to differentiate between bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotic organisms. In the earlier sections, we've already kind of talked about that a little bit, so that should already be starting to sound familiar and feel familiar to you. I do tend to use terms and repeat terms often because I think the more you hear things, the more likely it is to kind of stick in your head, and you'll remember it more. And then we'll also be able to identify 2 types of acellular. Remember, acellular means without a cell, so things like viruses and prions, and then compare and contrast different sizes of microorganisms. So what are the different characteristics? The 3 basic cell lines are the archaea, the eukarya, and the bacteria. And they differ from each other in kind of how they're constructed, what stuff do they have, and how complex they are, and that sort of thing. And they appeared at different lines in evolutionary history, as we saw earlier in one of the earlier presentations. The majority of microorganisms are single-celled. All bacteria and archaea are single-celled, and some eukaryotes are single-celled, particularly the ones in microbiology that we'll study, the protozoa. Protozoa. Now we'll see in that group, the larger being the protists include algae, and of course algae is not single-celled, but protozoa are. Some microorganisms are multicellular, and that would include helminths and some fungi. So fungi can either be single-cellular in when it's in the form of a yeast, but it's multicellular when it's in the form of a mold, for example, or as a mushroom, for example. So the cellular organization. Eukaryotic cells tend to be larger, and by definition, they have a nucleus. They also have other membrane-bound organelles like mitochondria. If they're plants, they'll have chloroplasts. They will have Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, all of the parts that we think of that make up a eukaryotic cell. We'll be going into more detail on that when we get to that chapter, but it's just in a general way. This graphic, if we want to look at the eukaryotic organisms, we would just look at the top 3 here. So this is the scolex of a hookworm, or sorry, a tapeworm rather. And you can see this is kind of how it anchors it. This part kind of drills into the mucosa of the intestine, and it kind of expands and hooks on like an anchor. And then it sucks in through the scolex here, it sucks in all the nutrients and things like that. And this is a multicellular eukaryotic organism. This is an example of a fungus, mucor. And again, this is a multicellular organism. And then this is a protozoan, which is a single cellular organism. So these are single organisms of this particular protozoa. Bacterial and archaeal cells. We can see here, this is an example of bacteria. This micrograph, these little dots are the bacteria on this. Here. Bacteria and archaea. We won't really talk a whole lot about archaea in our class. We'll learn a little bit about it, but not too much because it's not associated with human disease as far as we really know. They tend to be about 10 times smaller than eukaryotic cells. And you can kind of see if you look at the protozoa here, compare that to the bacteria here. I mean, these probably aren't under the same level of magnification, but nonetheless, bacteria much smaller. When you're in the laboratory, you're going to see slides of yeast Saccharomyces or Candida, I'm not sure which one you'll look at, or whatever yeast you look at, you'll see yeast cells and they're really big. And then you'll look at bacteria like Streptococcus or Staphylococcus or E. coli or whatever, it's going to be really small. So just notice the difference in sizes when you're in the laboratory. Make that distinction yourself. Pay attention to that. There are some ginormous bacteria that have been discovered. Those are mostly things that live in the oceans and in waters, but they can have cell sizes approaching eukaryotic cells or even bigger than the average eukaryotic cells. So size ranges vary from organism to organism, and being its biology, there's always going to be those rule breakers where you have some giant bacteria or some really tiny eukaryotic cell that just makes the cutoff. So things to think about. So bacteria and archaea cells, again, they fall into the prokaryotic designation or akaryotic designation. They don't have membrane bound structures like mitochondria or nucleus. They do have ribosomes and they do have plasma membranes and things like that. So they do share some features of the cells, but they also have some distinctions. And again, we'll learn more about these as we go through the semester. The acellular microorganisms are the viruses, and here this is an electron micrograph. You won't see any viruses in the laboratory because we don't have the microscopes that can see them. And again, viruses tend to be much, much, much smaller than bacterium, but there are some giant viruses that have also been discovered. And again, those are mostly things that live out, that exist out in the oceans and in waters, and tend to affect things like protozoas and bacteria and things like that that also live out in those microenvironments, not so much involving humans. But in this example, this is a single virus particle here, this is herpes simplex virus. And so this is, again, magnified probably 100,000 times or more. And then this is looking at a protein structure called a prion, that's just a protein that causes disease and can be transmitted from animals to human or human to human. And these are considered infectious proteins. And so those are two types of agents that can cause diseases that don't even have a cell structure. A virus just has some nucleic acid wrapped around with some protein wrapping around it in its very simplest form. Again, we'll talk a lot more about viruses when we get to that chapter. And then prions are simply just a protein. They don't even have nucleic acid. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this particular section. So you should be able to kind of see the relative sizes of different microorganisms. And I didn't really mention this, but why are helminths considered a study of microbiology, even though they can be really, really big? This is kind of a historical context because they fall into the realm of microbiology. Okay, that brings us to the